My name is Captain Jessica Williams, and I've spent the last 8 years flying F-16 Fighting Falcons at speeds that would make your heart stop. To the United States Air Force, I'm a decorated combat pilot who's logged over 2,000 flight hours in some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. But to my ex-husband Mark and his family, I'm just the woman who chose jets over dishes, missions over marriage, and apparently threw away the perfect life they had planned for me. Today, as I drove through the rolling hills of Austin toward Mark's wedding at the exclusive Riverside Country Club, they had no idea that the sky above their perfect celebration was about to remind them exactly who Captain Jessica Williams really is. The Texas sun blazed overhead as my rental car wound through the manicured landscape of West Austin, past million-dollar homes and perfectly trimmed lawns. For a moment, watching the peaceful suburbia roll by, I allowed myself to remember why I once thought this life might be enough. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe seeing Mark happy would finally close the chapter on our failed marriage. Maybe his family would finally look at me and see something other than the woman who destroyed their golden boy's dreams of domestic bliss. That fragile hope shattered with the buzz of my phone. A text from Patricia Thompson, my former mother-in-law, appeared on the screen like a missile lock warning. Jessica, please tell me you're not planning to wear anything military-related today. It's Ashley's Day, not a Veterans Day parade. Try to blend in for once. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles going white against the leather. Blend in, as if my entire existence was some garish display that needed to be muted for their comfort. The 3 Bronze Star medals I earned in combat zones where their worst fear was a delayed dinner reservation, reduced to an embarrassing fashion choice. The breath left my lungs in a controlled exhale, the same measured breathing I used when pulling G's in a supersonic climb. They wanted me to disappear into their world of country club conversations and wine tastings. They were about to discover that some things refuse to stay grounded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The decision to show up in my dress blue uniform wasn't born from that single condescending text. It had been building through years of subtle dismissals, each one a small course correction that eventually changed my entire flight path. The breaking point had crystallized 3 weeks ago, right after I'd returned from a grueling deployment to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where I'd spent 6 months flying counterterrorism missions over Syria. My small apartment near Randolph Air Force Base felt eerily quiet after months of constant engine noise and mission briefings. The silence was almost oppressive, after living in a world where every sound could mean the difference between life and death. I'd poured myself a glass of ice water, the cubes clinking in the sudden stillness, and made the mistake of checking social media to reconnect with the civilian world I'd left behind. That's when I saw it. A professionally staged photograph that felt like a punch to the gut. Mark, his face radiant with joy, spinning Ashley Parker in his arms on the terrace of some upscale restaurant in downtown Austin. She was wearing a flowing white sundress, her left hand prominently displayed to show off a diamond that could probably fund a squadron's worth of flight suits. The caption read, "She said yes. The future Mr. and Mrs. Thompson are over the moon." The engagement had happened while I was literally over the moon, flying night missions in foreign airspace, risking my life for the same freedom that allowed them to sip champagne and plan their perfect future. I scrolled through the flood of congratulatory comments. Patricia Thompson had left a string of heart emojis and wedding ring symbols. Mark's brother Kevin had commented, "Finally, a woman who knows what really matters." Robert Thompson, Mark's father, had shared the post with his own caption, "So proud of our son for finding someone who understands the value of family and tradition." I searched every comment, every tag, every corner of that digital celebration for any mention of our shared history. Nothing. It was as if our 3-year marriage had been completely erased from the official narrative. I wasn't even a footnote in their version of Mark's romantic journey. I was simply an unfortunate detour that led him to his true destination. The feeling wasn't heartbreak over losing Mark. That wound had healed long ago. This was something colder, more calculated. It was the realization that in their carefully curated world, my entire existence had been rewritten as a mistake. A temporary lapse in judgment that was now being corrected with the right kind of woman. Ashley Parker, with her marketing degree from UT and her Instagram feed full of brunches and shopping trips, represented everything they thought Mark should have chosen the first time. A week later, the formal invitation arrived in my mailbox like a mission briefing wrapped in expensive cardstock. The envelope was addressed to Ms. Jessica Williams, not Captain Williams, as if my rank was some kind of embarrassing nickname I'd grown out of. Inside, the invitation was embossed with gold lettering announcing the wedding at Riverside Country Club, complete with a weekend timeline of events I was apparently expected to navigate like some sort of social obstacle course. There was no personal note, no handwritten message acknowledging our shared history or the complexity of the situation. Just a QR code to scan for the RSVP and a small card listing the gift registry at stores I couldn't afford on a military salary. It felt less like an invitation, and more like a summons to witness my own replacement in the Thompson family narrative. That evening, I did something I rarely allowed myself to do. I called Major Ryan Davis not to complain about my personal drama, but to anchor myself in a world where my choices and sacrifices actually mattered. Ryan had been my squadron leader during 2 deployments, and he'd seen me at my worst and my best in situations where pretense was a luxury no one could afford. He picked up on the first ring, his voice carrying that familiar note of respect that civilian life seemed incapable of offering. "Captain Williams," he said, and just hearing my rank spoken with genuine recognition made something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "Ryan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They're getting married." There was a pause, but not the awkward kind. Ryan understood the weight of those simple words, the history they carried, and the pain they represented. "I see," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral, but supportive. "How are you handling that?" "They don't want a pilot at their perfect wedding, Ryan," I found myself saying, the words tasting bitter. "They want a ghost in a cocktail dress who'll smile politely and pretend the last 8 years never happened." The silence stretched between us, filled with the unspoken understanding of someone who'd watched me make impossible decisions under pressure, who'd seen me lead missions that brought everyone home safe. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm with the kind of loyalty forged in shared danger. "Captain," he said, and the single word carried the weight of every mission we'd flown together, every impossible situation we'd navigated, every moment when my leadership had meant the difference between success and catastrophe. "You've never been anyone's ghost. You're the pilot who brought Falcon Squadron home intact from 12 combat deployments. Your light doesn't dim just because some people are too small-minded to see it." His words didn't heal the wound, but they reminded me who I was when I stepped away from their diminishing mirrors and toxic expectations. I ended the call and walked to my closet, where my dress blue uniform hung in its protective bag like armor waiting for battle. The weight of Patricia Thompson's text message sat heavier in my mind than any G-force I'd ever endured in a fighter jet. It wasn't just another passive-aggressive comment from my former mother-in-law. It was the echo of 3 years of marriage, where my accomplishments were treated like embarrassing hobbies that needed to be managed and contained. As I gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching the Austin skyline shimmer in the distance, my mind drifted back to a memory that still burned with perfect clarity. The day I'd earned my wings at Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio had been the culmination of 2 years of the most grueling training imaginable. The graduation ceremony was held on the flight line, with rows of gleaming T-6 Texan trainers lined up like silver birds against the endless Texas sky. The air was electric with the sound of jet engines and the cheers of families who understood that what they were witnessing wasn't just a career milestone, but the birth of someone who would carry the responsibility of national defense on their shoulders. I stood there in my crisp dress blues, the new silver wings pinned to my chest, still feeling foreign and wonderful, my eyes scanning the crowd for the faces that mattered most to me. I'd circled their seats on the venue map, sent them detailed directions, even arranged for base passes weeks in advance. The moment had finally arrived when Jessica Williams would officially become a United States Air Force pilot, and I wanted the people I loved to witness it. But when I looked towards Section C, Row 15, seats 12 through 16, I saw nothing but empty metal chairs glinting in the harsh Texas sun. The sight hit me like sudden turbulence, making my stomach drop even as my feet remained firmly planted on the tarmac. Around me, my classmates were embracing parents, posing for photos with grandparents, sharing tears of joy with spouses who understood the magnitude of what we'd just accomplished. The phone call had come that morning while I was polishing the brass buttons on my uniform with the obsessive attention to detail that the Air Force had drilled into me. Mark's voice was hurried and slightly annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something more important than the biggest day of my career thus far. Jess, listen. Something's come up with Dad's business. There's this huge client meeting in Dallas that could make or break the quarterly numbers. You know how it is. Before I could respond, Patricia's voice came on the line, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as bitter. We're so proud of you, sweetie, you know that. But this is just training, isn't it? It's not like you're actually going to war or anything. There'll be plenty of other ceremonies. Her tone carried that particular brand of dismissal that wealthy people used when they wanted to make their priorities sound reasonable and yours sound trivial. Mark chimed back in, his voice already distracted by whatever was happening in the background. We'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can take you out to that steakhouse you like when you get back home. That steakhouse you like. As if my favorite restaurant was some consolation prize for missing the moment I'd worked toward for 2 solid years of 18-hour days. Simulator sickness, and emergency procedures that could mean the difference between life and death. Kevin, Mark's younger brother, had gotten on the line briefly to explain that he couldn't make it either because of some fraternity formal at UT. A college party ranked higher than his sister-in-law becoming a military pilot. The casual way they dismissed something I'd nearly killed myself to achieve was breathtaking in its thoughtless cruelty. They weren't malicious, which somehow made it worse. They simply could not comprehend that my world operated on a different scale of importance than theirs. I stood among my celebrating classmates, watching fathers pin wings on their daughters' uniforms, mothers wiping away proud tears, and spouses who understood that they were witnessing the birth of someone who would defend freedom itself. The photos I have from that day show me with 3 other pilots from my training class, our arms around each other's shoulders, smiling with the forced brightness of people who are determined not to let disappointment ruin their moment. But if you look closely at my eyes in those pictures, you can see the hollow space where my family's pride should have been. You can see the moment I realized that the people who were supposed to love me most had fundamentally misunderstood who I was becoming and what that meant. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my first duty assignment at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Inside was a check for $3,000 and a note written on Patricia's expensive personal stationery. Congratulations on your graduation, dear. We thought you might like to treat yourself to something nice. Perhaps a spa weekend, or some new civilian clothes for when you come home. A spa weekend. They had reduced 2 years of punishing training, the mastery of a machine worth $30 million, and the oath I'd sworn to defend the Constitution with my life, to a suggestion that I get a massage and buy some pretty dresses. It wasn't just thoughtless, it was insulting on a level that cut deeper than any criticism could have. They had translated my achievement into the only language they understood, leisure and consumption. I remember standing in my sparse bachelor officer quarters, holding that check and feeling the paper tremble slightly in my hands. The amount was more than I made in 2 months as a second lieutenant, but it felt like blood money. It was their way of putting a price tag on something that couldn't be bought, of reducing the most meaningful accomplishment of my life to a transaction that made them feel better about their absence. With deliberate precision, I tore that check into small, even pieces, and let them fall into the metal wastebasket beside my desk like confetti at a celebration they'd chosen not to attend. It was the last time I ever expected them to understand what my service meant, and the first time I realized that their version of love came with conditions I could never meet. The pattern continued throughout my marriage to Mark, a slow erosion of respect disguised as concern for my well-being. Every promotion was met with questions about when I'd be ready to settle down and start a real family. Every deployment brought lectures about the strain I was putting on our relationship. Every medal or commendation was acknowledged with the kind of polite confusion people reserved for hobbies they found incomprehensible, but were too polite to openly criticize. The breaking point came during my first combat deployment to the Middle East. I'd been flying missions over Syria for 3 months, navigating some of the most complex and dangerous airspace in the world, when I managed to get a satellite connection for a brief call home. The time difference meant it was evening in Austin, and I could hear the familiar sounds of one of Patricia's dinner parties in the background. clinking crystal, soft jazz, and the murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation plans. Mark answered after several rings, his voice carrying the slight slur that meant he'd been sampling the expensive wine his mother favored for her social gatherings. "Oh, hey, Jess. This isn't really a great time. Mom's got the Hendersons over, and you know how she gets about phone calls during dinner." Through the static and delay of the international connection, I tried to explain where I was, what I was doing, the weight of the missions I was flying. I spoke about the precision required to navigate surface-to-air missile threats, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and international incident, the responsibility I carried for the pilots under my command. My voice was probably distorted by the connection, but the excitement and pride in my tone should have been unmistakable. "That's nice, honey," Mark said, his attention clearly divided. "Listen, Ashley Parker from the country club was asking about you. You remember her, right? She's working at that boutique marketing firm now, making really good money, and she seems so happy. Maybe when you get back we can all have dinner together. You might learn something about work-life balance." Work-life balance. While I was risking my life to protect the freedom that allowed him to attend dinner parties and discuss boutique marketing careers, he was suggesting I needed to learn about priorities from someone who curated Instagram feeds for local restaurants. The irony was so profound it took my breath away. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before Patricia's voice in the background complained about the food getting cold. Mark promised to call me back later, but that call never came. While I sat in a cramped ready room 12 time zones away, surrounded by maps of hostile territory and mission briefings that could determine the safety of ground troops, they were discussing wine pairings and vacation plans as if the world beyond their bubble didn't exist. That night, lying on my narrow bunk in the female officers' quarters, I finally understood something that had been building for months. The distance between us wasn't geographical. It wasn't caused by my deployments or my schedule or the demands of military life. It was fundamental, unbridgeable. We existed in different universes with different laws of physics, where my life and death responsibilities were invisible to people who measured importance in social currency and comfort. The divorce wasn't bitter or dramatic. It was almost anticlimactic in its quiet inevitability. Mark wanted someone who would attend his parents' dinner parties without talking about missile defense systems. He wanted someone whose career complemented his family's social aspirations rather than challenging their worldview. He wanted Ashley Parker, with her marketing background and her understanding of what really mattered in their insular world of country clubs and cocktail conversations. I wanted someone who understood that when I said I couldn't make it to a dinner party because I was briefing a night mission over hostile territory, that wasn't a choice between competing social obligations. It was the difference between protecting American interests and disappointing people who thought my service was an elaborate form of attention-seeking. The morning I signed the divorce papers, Mark looked at me across the conference table at his lawyer's office and said something I'll never forget. "I really did love you, Jess. But I needed a wife, not a war story." He meant it as an explanation, maybe even an apology. But what I heard was a final confirmation that in his world, my entire professional identity was just an anecdote, something that happened to me, rather than something I chose and fought for every single day. The lawyer, a friend of Robert Thompson's who specialized in discretionary divorces for Austin's elite families, slid the papers toward me with practiced efficiency. The settlement was generous by civilian standards, enough to buy a nice car or put a down payment on a house in a good neighborhood. But it felt like another check meant to put a price on something invaluable, another attempt to reduce my choices to dollars and cents. I signed my name with the same pen I'd used to sign mission reports that affected international policy, feeling the weight of closing one chapter while others remained unwritten. Mark smiled with relief, already mentally planning his future with someone who would fit seamlessly into the life his parents had mapped out for him. 3 months later, I was reassigned to the Pentagon as a liaison officer, a position that required security clearances most people couldn't even pronounce and expertise in weapons systems that could reshape global conflicts. It was the kind of assignment that marked an officer as someone being groomed for senior leadership, someone the Air Force saw as having the potential to make strategic decisions at the highest levels. When I called to share the news, thinking that maybe this time they'd recognize the significance of what I was achieving, Patricia's response was immediate and predictable. "Oh, that's wonderful, dear. Will you be working normal hours now? Maybe you'll finally have time to meet someone suitable. Normal hours." As if my promotion to one of the most sensitive positions in the military was primarily valuable because it might improve my dating prospects. It was the last conversation I initiated with any of them. From that point forward, our communication consisted of Christmas cards with generic messages and birthday texts that felt like calendar reminders rather than expressions of genuine affection. They had made it clear that they saw my military career as an obstacle to the life they thought I should want, and I had finally accepted that their version of love was contingent on my willingness to abandon everything that made me who I was. Now, 3 years later, driving toward Mark's wedding with their dismissive text fresh in my memory, I realized that nothing had changed except my willingness to pretend their opinion mattered. They still saw Captain Jessica Williams as an embarrassment to be managed, a reminder that their golden boy had once made the mistake of marrying someone who refused to be diminished by their expectations. They wanted me to blend in, to disappear into the background of their perfect celebration like a ghost wearing a conservative dress and a polite smile. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to erase had spent the last 3 years learning things about power and precision that would make their country club politics look like children playing dress-up. The Texas countryside rolled past my window, peaceful and deceptively simple, as I made the final turn toward Riverside Country Club. In a few hours, Mark would marry Ashley Parker, in a ceremony designed to erase any trace of his previous marriage and establish his proper place in Austin society. The guest list would be full of people who saw my military service as an interesting quirk rather than a calling that defined my entire existence. They were expecting the diminished version of Jessica Williams, the one who had learned to make herself smaller to fit into their narrow world. Instead, they were about to meet Captain Williams, and she was bringing backup. The moment that shattered any remaining illusion about my place in their world hadn't happened at our wedding or even during our marriage. It occurred 6 months after our divorce was finalized, when I discovered something that revealed the true depth of their calculated erasure. I was cleaning out the last boxes from our shared house in West Austin, the one Mark had kept in the settlement, when I found something that stopped me cold. Hidden behind a stack of Patricia's Garden Club newsletters in the kitchen junk drawer was a small leather photo album I'd never seen before. The cover was embossed with gold lettering that read Thompson Family Memories 2018 to 2022, spanning the exact years of my marriage to Mark. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, expecting to see the usual collection of family gatherings, holidays, and milestone celebrations that Patricia loved to document with obsessive precision. What I found instead was a comprehensive revision of history that took my breath away. Page after page showed Mark's life during our marriage, but I had been systematically edited out of every single photograph. There was Mark at his promotion celebration at the law firm, standing alone where I had originally stood beside him in my dress uniform, fresh from a deployment ceremony. The empty space next to him had been cropped so carefully that you'd never know someone had been removed. There was Mark at Patricia's 65th birthday party, surrounded by family members who were all looking at something just outside the frame. In the original photo, they had been looking at me as I delivered a toast about Patricia's strength and resilience, drawing parallels to the courage I'd witnessed in my fellow service members. The speech had been well received that night, but in this version, I was a ghost whose words hung in empty air. Page after page revealed the same meticulous editing. Christmas mornings where my gifts sat under the tree with no giver. Easter brunches where conversations appeared to happen with invisible participants. Even their annual 4th of July barbecue, where I had been specifically invited because Patricia said it would be meaningful to have a real military member present during the patriotic celebration. In these photos, the American flag I had presented to them that day appeared to be floating in mid-air, held by hands that had been erased from existence. The most devastating image was from Mark's law school graduation party, an event I had flown back from advanced combat training to attend, despite being exhausted and jet-lagged from weeks of high-altitude exercises. In the original photo, I was pinning a boutonniere on Mark's lapel while he smiled down at me, both of us laughing at something Kevin had said. It had been one of the happiest moments of our relationship, a rare instance when his family seemed to accept that my military commitments were important, but that I would always prioritize him when it truly mattered. In Patricia's revised version, Mark appeared to be pinning the boutonniere on himself, his hands positioned in an awkward way that would have looked strange to anyone who didn't know what they were actually seeing. But the most chilling detail was his expression. Patricia had chosen to keep this particular photo despite the obvious editing problems, because Mark's face showed such genuine joy. She had preserved his happiness while erasing its source. At the back of the album was a small envelope containing the original photos, the ones that showed the complete truth. Each one had small pencil marks indicating where the cuts should be made, technical notes about lighting adjustments, and in some cases multiple versions showing the progression of my removal. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or an emotional reaction to our divorce. This was a systematic campaign to rewrite history, planned and executed with the precision of a military operation. The most damning piece of evidence was a handwritten note tucked between the pages, written in Patricia's distinctive script on her personal letterhead. For Ashley's wedding planning, she should see Mark's family history without any distractions from his first mistake. These photos show the real Mark, the one we always knew was there. My first mistake. 3 years of marriage, of trying to balance military service with family obligations, of missing missions and opportunities to attend their events, of enduring their passive-aggressive comments about my career choices, reduced to a mistake that needed to be corrected through historical revision. I wasn't just being written out of their future. I was being erased from their past. I sat on the kitchen floor of what had once been our shared home, surrounded by boxes of my belongings and this evidence of their methodical betrayal, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by something colder and more dangerous. They hadn't just rejected me. They had tried to steal my history, to deny that our shared experiences had ever happened. The wedding planning had been happening for 8 months. I learned from conversations I overheard during the few family events I still attended out of stubborn politeness. Ashley Parker had been given full access to the Thompson family archives to help her understand Mark's background and create a celebration that honored his heritage. She had been shown these edited photos as evidence of his family's values and traditions, with no knowledge that she was seeing a fabricated version of recent history. But what truly made my blood run cold was realizing that this wasn't just about removing me from their family narrative. It was about preparing Ashley to be the Thompson daughter-in-law I had refused to become. Every cropped photo, every erased moment, was being used to create a template for how she should fit into their world. Where I had been eliminated, she would be inserted. Where I had challenged their expectations, she would conform. I spent the next 3 hours going through every box in that house, looking for more evidence of their historical revision project. What I found was worse than I had imagined. They hadn't just edited photos. They had removed or replaced every trace of my military service from the house we had shared. The shadow box containing my combat medals that had hung in the living room was gone, replaced by a generic landscape painting. The American flag that had been draped over my grandfather's coffin at Arlington National Cemetery, which I had displayed with pride in our bedroom, had been replaced with decorative throw pillows. Even my books were gone, the technical manuals on aircraft systems and military strategy that I studied to stay current with evolving technologies. In their place were coffee table books about interior design and entertaining, as if they were creating a museum exhibit titled, "What Mark's House Should Have Looked Like All Along." The kitchen revealed the most personal violation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The magnetic strips that had held my military challenge coins were still on the refrigerator, but the coins themselves had been replaced with decorative magnets advertising local restaurants and boutiques. These coins weren't just military memorabilia. Each one represented a specific deployment, a successful mission, a moment when my leadership had made the difference between success and failure. They were tangible proof of my professional achievements, and they had been discarded like expired coupons. I found them eventually, tossed into a grocery bag in the garage along with my flight helmets, my survival gear, and other items that Patricia had deemed inappropriate for a proper family home. The casual way these irreplaceable pieces of my identity had been treated felt like a physical assault. These weren't just objects to them. They were embarrassments that needed to be hidden away so that Ashley could move into a space that reflected their ideal vision of Mark's life. But the most devastating discovery was a planning document I found in Patricia's handwriting, outlining the wedding timeline and guest management strategy. Under a section titled Potential Problems, my name appeared with detailed notes about how to minimize my impact on their perfect day. Seat Jessica at back table with elderly relatives who won't engage in military talk. Brief Ashley beforehand about Jessica's tendency to dominate conversations with inappropriate war stories. Have Kevin ready to redirect any toasts or speeches that mention Jessica's service record. Inappropriate war stories. They were referring to accounts of combat missions where I had risked my life to protect American interests. Moments of genuine heroism and sacrifice that they saw as social awkwardness that needed to be managed. The disconnect was so profound that I actually laughed out loud, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty house. They had reduced my entire professional identity to a behavioral problem that required crowd control. In their minds, my experiences defending democracy were less appropriate for public discussion than Kevin's fraternity stories or Robert's golf tournament victories. The scale of their misunderstanding was breathtaking, but what made it truly infuriating was the calculated nature of their dismissal. This wasn't ignorance or thoughtlessness. This was strategic minimization designed to protect their preferred narrative about who Mark was and what his life should look like. They had studied my habits, anticipated my reactions, and developed countermeasures to neutralize any inconvenient reminders of my existence at their celebration. I drove back to my base housing that evening with Patricia's planning document in my briefcase and a new understanding of exactly what I was dealing with. They hadn't just moved on from our failed marriage. They had declared war on my very existence, using weapons I had been too naive to recognize: social manipulation, historical revision, and the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths. That night, I did something I hadn't done since my divorce was finalized. I called Major Ryan Davis, not for emotional support this time, but for tactical consultation. Ryan had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood something that civilians like the Thompson family never could. When someone declares war on you, your only options are surrender or victory. Ryan, I said when he answered, my voice carrying the crisp precision of a mission briefing. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone was systematically trying to erase your service record, rewrite your history, and convince the world that your military career was a mistake that never should have happened, how would you respond? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for me to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge I had only heard during combat operations. Captain Williams, he said, using my rank with the kind of emphasis that meant he was about to say something important. Are you telling me that someone is actively disrespecting not just you, but the uniform you wear and everything it represents? That's exactly what I'm telling you, I replied. And then I explained everything. The edited photos, the stolen military memorabilia, the planning document that treated my service record as an embarrassment to be managed. Ryan listened without interruption, and I could practically hear him processing the tactical situation. Ma'am, he said when I finished, with all due respect, this isn't about a family dispute anymore. This is about people who think military service is something to be ashamed of, something that needs to be hidden away so their little party can proceed, without any uncomfortable reminders about who's actually defending their freedom to have parties. He was right, of course. This had never been about Mark choosing Ashley over me, or even about my ex-in-laws preferring a daughter-in-law who fit their social expectations. This was about their fundamental disrespect for the military, their belief that people like me were somehow lesser, inappropriate, embarrassing. What would you recommend, Major? I asked, slipping into the formal military communication style that had become second nature over years of joint operations. Ryan's laugh was low and dangerous. Captain, I think it's time they learned what it means to disrespect an American military officer. and I think I know exactly how to teach them that lesson. The plan he outlined was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. It wouldn't require breaking any laws or violating any regulations. It would simply involve showing them, in the most public way possible, exactly who Captain Jessica Williams was and what she was capable of when properly motivated. The beauty of it, Ryan explained, is that we'll be using their own event against them. They want a perfect wedding with no military distractions? We'll give them a wedding they'll never forget, one that makes it impossible for anyone present to ignore exactly what they've been trying to erase. As he laid out the details, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my combat deployments: the fierce joy of a mission with clear objectives and the resources to achieve them. Patricia Thompson thought she could manage me like a social problem. She was about to discover that some problems fight back, and when they do, they bring friends. The Thompson family had made a critical tactical error. They had underestimated their opponent, misunderstood the resources at her disposal, and failed to consider the possibility that their systematic campaign of disrespect might provoke a response. They were about to learn that when you declare war on a combat-tested F-16 pilot, you better make sure you understand what you're fighting against. Because Captain Jessica Williams was done being their embarrassment, it was time for them to be hers. The pattern of dismissal hadn't begun with my military career. It stretched back to my childhood, woven through every significant moment, like a thread of casual cruelty that I had somehow learned to accept as normal. Growing up in Fredericksburg, a small Texas town where football games and church socials defined the social calendar, I had always been the girl who looked up instead of around, who asked questions about how things worked rather than what people thought about them. My fascination with aviation began at age 8, during an air show at Randolph Air Force Base that my father had grudgingly attended because his business partner had extra tickets. While other children were buying cotton candy and complaining about the heat, I stood transfixed as the Thunderbirds roared overhead in perfect formation, their blue and yellow F-16s cutting through the Texas sky with a precision that made my heart race. I remember tugging on my father's sleeve, pointing at the jets as they performed a knife-edge pass so low I could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. "Dad, how do they make the planes do that? How do they fly so close together without crashing?" My questions came in an excited rush, but his response was distracted and dismissive. "It's just a show, Jessica. Let's go get some funnel cake." But I couldn't let it go. That night at dinner, I peppered my parents with questions about flight dynamics, thrust-to-weight ratios, and G-forces, concepts I didn't fully understand but desperately wanted to learn. My mother, Linda, exchanged one of those looks with my father that I would come to recognize as their silent communication about my inappropriate interests. "Sweetie," my mother said in that patient voice adults use when they think children are being silly, "those are very complex things that pilots study for years. Maybe you'd like to learn about something more suitable, like music or art?" She gestured toward the piano in our living room, the one she'd insisted on buying despite my complete lack of interest in playing it. The next Christmas, when I asked for books about aircraft and flight training, I found beautifully wrapped packages containing ballet shoes, art supplies, and a jewelry-making kit under the tree. My parents smiled expectantly as I opened each gift, waiting for the enthusiasm that never came. When I politely asked if we could exchange some of the gifts for the aviation books I'd specifically requested, my father's expression hardened. "Jessica, we spent a lot of time and money selecting these gifts. The least you can do is show some appreciation for our efforts to help you develop proper interests for a young lady." Proper interests. Even at 9 years old, I understood that my fascination with military aviation had been classified as improper, something that needed to be corrected rather than encouraged. By middle school, the divide had become more pronounced. While my classmates were joining cheerleading squads and discussing boy bands, I was building model aircraft and devouring every book about military history I could find at the local library. My bedroom walls were covered with posters of fighter jets and Air Force bases, a shrine to possibilities that my parents viewed with increasing concern. The breaking point came during my sophomore year of high school, when I announced my intention to apply for the Air Force Academy. I had spent months researching the application process, maintaining a 4 0 GPA, participating in athletics, and even learning about the congressional nomination requirements. I presented my plan to my parents with the thoroughness of a military briefing, complete with charts showing career progression paths and salary projections for Air Force officers. My father listened to my entire presentation in silence, his face growing darker with each slide I showed him. When I finished, he set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not just disappointment, but something closer to disgust. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "no daughter of mine is going to throw her life away playing soldier. The military is for people who have no other options, no real intelligence or ambition." "You're better than that." He gestured around our comfortable middle-class home, with its carefully chosen furniture and family photos arranged just so. "This is what success looks like. Stability, respectability, a place in the community that matters." My mother nodded in agreement, adding her own perspective with the kind of gentle cruelty she had perfected over the years. "Honey, you're such a smart, pretty girl. You could marry well, have beautiful children, be part of something meaningful. Why would you want to waste that by running around with a bunch of rough military people?" The conversation devolved into an argument that lasted for hours, with my parents using every weapon in their emotional arsenal to dissuade me from my chosen path. They questioned my intelligence, my judgment, my understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. They painted pictures of loneliness, poverty, and social isolation that would supposedly result from my military service. They offered bribes, a new car if I agreed to apply to traditional colleges, a shopping trip to Dallas if I would consider more feminine career paths. When none of their tactics worked, they resorted to ultimatums. "If you insist on this military nonsense," my father said, his voice cold and final, "don't expect us to support you. We won't attend your graduation, we won't celebrate your achievements, and we won't pretend to be proud of choices we find fundamentally wrong." I was 17 years old, still dependent on them for basic necessities, still naive enough to believe that parents were supposed to support their children's dreams, even when they didn't understand them. The threat of complete abandonment was terrifying, but not enough to make me abandon the vision I had for my life. "Then I guess I'll do it without your support," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "But I'm not changing my mind." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother began to cry, not the tears of a parent grieving her child's poor choices, but the calculated weeping of someone who had expected emotional manipulation to work and was frustrated by its failure. My father stood up from the kitchen table and walked out of the room without another word. For the remaining 18 months I lived in their house, they treated my military aspirations like a terminal illness that we were all pretending not to discuss. They stopped asking about my grades, my extracurricular activities, or my college applications. When teachers or neighbors asked about my post-graduation plans, they would change the subject or give vague answers about my still figuring things out. The day my congressional nomination letter arrived, I opened it alone in the kitchen after school, my hands trembling as I read the official confirmation that I had been selected for appointment to the United States Air Force Academy. It was the culmination of 2 years of work, the validation of every sacrifice I had made to pursue my dreams despite their opposition. I walked into the living room where my parents were watching television, the letter clutched in my suddenly steady hands. "I got in," I said, my voice filled with quiet triumph. "Full appointment, starting next summer." My father glanced up from his newspaper, his expression unchanged. "That's nice, dear," he said as if I had told him I was going to the grocery store. My mother didn't even look away from her magazine. That was it. No congratulations. No recognition of the significance of what I had accomplished. No acknowledgement that their daughter had achieved something remarkable. Just casual indifference designed to minimize an achievement they couldn't bring themselves to celebrate. The night before I left for Colorado Springs, my mother knocked on my bedroom door and entered without waiting for permission. She stood in the doorway looking at my packed bags and the empty walls where my aircraft posters had once hung, her face a mixture of sadness and stubborn disapproval. "You know," she said softly, "it's not too late to change your mind. You could defer for a year, go to UT like your cousin Sarah. Meet some nice boys, Figure out what you really want." Her voice carried a desperate hope that I would finally come to my senses and choose the path they had mapped out for me. I looked at her standing there in her silk robe and perfectly styled hair. A woman who had never wanted anything beyond the boundaries of her comfortable, predictable world, and felt a profound sadness for the gulf between us that could never be bridged. "Mom," I said gently, "this is what I really want. This is who I am." She nodded as if she had expected my answer, but her eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine for the first time in months. "I just don't understand why you have to be so difficult," she whispered. "Why can't you just be normal?" Normal. There it was, the word that had haunted my entire adolescence. Normal meant accepting their limitations as my own. Normal meant choosing safety over purpose, comfort over challenge, approval over authenticity. Normal meant becoming someone I could never respect. "Because normal isn't enough for me," I replied, my voice firm but not unkind. "And someday, I hope you'll understand that." The drive to Colorado Springs was silent except for the radio, my father's jaw set in grim resignation as he fulfilled his parental obligation to deliver me to what he still considered my biggest mistake. We ate lunch at a chain restaurant near the academy, making stilted conversation about the weather and the landscape, while carefully avoiding any mention of what was about to happen. At the gates of the Air Force Academy, with its soaring modernist architecture and views of the Rocky Mountains that took my breath away, my father finally spoke the words I had been waiting to hear for 2 years. "I hope you know what you're doing, Jessica, and I hope it makes you happy." It wasn't approval exactly, but it was the closest thing to acceptance I was likely to get from him. My mother hugged me awkwardly, her designer perfume clashing with the crisp mountain air, and whispered, "Call us when you realize you want to come home." I watched their car disappear down the winding road toward the interstate, carrying them back to their predictable world of dinner parties and golf tournaments and conversations that never ventured beyond the safe boundaries of suburban propriety. I stood there in my civilian clothes for the last time, breathing the thin Colorado air and feeling more free than I had ever felt in my 17 years. 4 years later, when I graduated from the academy with honors and received my commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force, my parents' absence was both expected and devastating. I had hoped, despite everything, that witnessing my transformation from rebellious teenager to military officer might finally make them understand what I had been trying to tell them all along. But their empty seats in the stands were just another reminder that their love came with conditions I could never meet. They wanted a daughter who would validate their choices by making the same ones. Instead, they got a daughter who challenged everything they believed about success, purpose, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. The other cadets around me were embracing parents, siblings, grandparents, who had traveled across the country to witness this moment of triumph. I stood alone in my dress blues, my newly pinned second lieutenant bars catching the Colorado sunlight, and made a promise to myself that I would never again seek validation from people who were incapable of giving it. That promise had served me well throughout my military career, through flight school and combat training, and deployments to places my parents couldn't pronounce. But somehow, when Mark Thompson entered my life during my first assignment at Nellis, I had allowed myself to hope that his family might be different, that I might finally find the acceptance I had been denied in childhood. The Thompson family had seemed sophisticated, worldly, more educated than my small-town parents. Patricia spoke multiple languages and had traveled extensively. Robert had built a successful business empire and moved in circles that included politicians and celebrities. Kevin was attending one of the best universities in the country. Surely people with such broad experience would be able to appreciate the value of military service, the honor of defending American interests around the world. I had been spectacularly wrong. The Thompsons weren't more enlightened than my parents. They were more refined in their disapproval, more elegant in their dismissal, more sophisticated in their ability to make me feel small. Where my parents had used blunt force trauma, the Thompsons employed surgical precision, cutting away my confidence and self-worth with smiles and passive-aggressive comments that left no visible wounds. Now, driving toward Mark's wedding to Ashley Parker, I realized that both families had been trying to teach me the same lesson, that Jessica Williams, the girl who looked up at fighter jets and decided she wanted to fly them, was somehow wrong, inappropriate, embarrassing. That my dreams were too big, my ambitions too masculine, my sense of purpose too threatening to their comfortable worldview. They had spent nearly 30 years trying to convince me that I was the problem, that my refusal to conform to their expectations was a character flaw that needed to be corrected. But sitting in that rental car with Patricia's dismissive text message still glowing on my phone screen, I finally understood the truth they had been trying to hide. I wasn't their problem. I was their reminder that there were other ways to live, other definitions of success, other sources of meaning beyond their narrow understanding of what mattered. I was proof that their choices weren't the only choices, their values weren't the only values, their version of a meaningful life wasn't the only version worth living. And today, they were going to be reminded of exactly what they had spent so many years trying to forget. The plan Major Ryan Davis and I had crafted was more than just revenge. It was a precision strike designed to accomplish multiple objectives with surgical accuracy. We weren't just going to embarrass the Thompson family at Mark's wedding. We were going to educate them about the true cost of disrespecting American military service, and we were going to do it in a way that would make national news and serve as a warning to anyone else who thought they could treat combat veterans like social embarrassments. The beauty of our operation lay in its complete legitimacy. Everything we were planning to do was not only legal, but officially sanctioned. The flyover we had arranged wasn't some rogue mission flown by sympathetic pilots. It was a formal demonstration, authorized by the Pentagon as part of a public relations initiative to increase civilian understanding of Air Force capabilities. The timing of this demonstration to coincide with a private wedding in Austin was, as Ryan put it, a fortunate coincidence that serves multiple strategic purposes. My arrival at Riverside Country Club was timed with military precision. I pulled into the circular drive at exactly 1400 hours, my dress blue uniform pressed to perfection, my silver captain's bars polished to mirror brightness, and my Bronze Star medals arranged in precise regulation order across my chest. The valet, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me step out of the rental car. "Ma'am," he stammered, snapping to attention in a way that suggested prior military training, "welcome to Riverside Country Club." His eyes took in my uniform and decorations with the kind of recognition that civilian families like the Thompsons never bothered to develop. "Are you here for the Thompson-Parker wedding?" "I am indeed," I replied, handing him my keys with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Captain Jessica Williams, United States Air Force. I believe they're expecting me." The lobby of the country club was filled with wedding guests in elegant cocktail attire, the kind of carefully coordinated outfits that cost more than most Air Force enlisted personnel made in a month. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as I walked through the crowd, my military bearing unmistakable even to people who had never served a day in uniform. Some guests looked curious, others confused, and a few appeared genuinely impressed by the sight of a decorated combat veteran in their midst. I spotted Patricia Thompson across the room, resplendent in a powder blue mother-of-the-groom dress that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. Her face went through a fascinating series of expressions when she saw me: surprise, horror, fury, and finally a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. She excused herself from her conversation with what appeared to be painful politeness, and marched toward me with the determination of a general advancing on enemy territory. "Jessica," she said through clenched teeth, her voice barely above a whisper but vibrating with barely controlled rage. "What do you think you're doing? We specifically asked you not to wear anything military-related today." I looked down at my uniform as if seeing it for the first time, then back at her with genuine confusion. "Patricia, this is my dress blue uniform. It's the appropriate formal attire for a United States Air Force officer attending a significant social function. I wouldn't dream of wearing anything less dignified to Mark's special day." Her face flushed red above the carefully applied makeup. "You're doing this on purpose. You're trying to ruin Ashley's wedding, to make everything about you and your ridiculous military career." "On the contrary," I replied, my voice carrying the kind of calm authority I used when briefing mission parameters to my squadron. "I'm here to honor Mark's new marriage, and to represent the United States Air Force at what I'm sure will be a memorable celebration. I thought you would be proud to have a decorated combat veteran in your family photos." Before Patricia could respond, Ashley Parker appeared at her side, looking like a vision in ivory silk and French lace. The wedding dress was undoubtedly expensive, the kind of creation that required multiple fittings and consultations with designers whose names I would never recognize. Ashley's smile was as polished as everything else about her, but I could see uncertainty in her eyes as she tried to process the situation. "Jessica," Ashley said with determined cheerfulness, "you look so official. I had no idea Mark's first wife was in the military. How exciting." Her voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had been carefully coached on how to handle potentially awkward situations, but hadn't quite anticipated this particular scenario. Patricia's face went from red to purple. "Ashley, dear, why don't you go check on the photographer? I'm sure they're ready for more pre-ceremony shots." It was clearly a dismissal designed to remove Ashley from what Patricia anticipated would be an unpleasant confrontation. But Ashley, bless her heart, seemed genuinely interested in learning more about my service. "Oh, but I'd love to hear about Jessica's military experience. Mark never really talks about it, and I think it's so fascinating that women can be pilots now. Do you actually fly those big cargo planes?" I smiled at her with genuine warmth, appreciating her curiosity, even as I prepared to deliver information that would probably shock her. "Actually, Ashley, I fly F-16 Fighting Falcons. I'm a combat pilot with 3 deployment tours to the Middle East and over 2,000 hours of flight time in hostile airspace." Ashley's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "You fly fighter jets? Like in Top Gun? That's incredible. How fast do they go?" "The F-16 has a maximum speed of over Mach 2, which translates to about 1,500 miles per hour. I explained, enjoying the look of fascination on Ashley's face and the look of horror on Patricia's. "But most of our combat missions are flown at subsonic speeds to maximize fuel efficiency and weapons accuracy." Patricia grabbed Ashley's arm with barely concealed desperation. "Ashley, we really do need to get you back to the bridal suite. The photographer is on a very tight schedule." As Ashley reluctantly allowed herself to be led away, she called back over her shoulder, "I hope we can talk more later. I have so many questions about your military service." Patricia shot me a look that could have downed an enemy aircraft, but before she could voice whatever threat she was formulating, Robert Thompson appeared at her elbow. Mark's father looked distinguished in his expensive tuxedo, every inch the successful businessman who was accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. "Jessica," he said with the kind of professional courtesy he might use with a difficult client, "I think there may be some confusion about today's dress code. This is a formal civilian celebration. Perhaps you could step outside and call someone to bring you more appropriate attire." I met his gaze with the steady confidence of an officer who had stared down enemy pilots at 30,000 feet. "Robert, I appreciate your concern, but I'm dressed in accordance with Air Force regulations for formal social functions. This uniform represents my oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, including the freedoms that allow celebrations like this to take place in safety and security." Robert's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Kevin Thompson bounded over with the kind of aggressive friendliness that usually preceded some form of public humiliation. Mark's younger brother had clearly been drinking, and his face was flushed with alcohol and what looked like malicious anticipation. "Well, well, well," Kevin said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "if it isn't Captain Jessica, still playing dress-up soldier. Tell me, Jess, do you wear that costume everywhere, or just to places where you want maximum attention?" The conversations around us stopped entirely. Wedding guests turned to stare at our little tableau, sensing drama but not yet understanding its nature. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond to Kevin's public provocation. I smiled at Kevin with the kind of patient tolerance I reserved for particularly slow-learning flight students. "Kevin, this isn't a costume. These are the dress blues of a United States Air Force captain who has flown combat missions in defense of American interests. The ribbons on my chest represent medals earned in actual combat, not participation trophies from college fraternity events." Kevin's face went red, but he pressed on with the kind of drunken bravado that overrode common sense. "Come on, everyone knows the military is just welfare for people who can't make it in the real world. I mean, what do you actually do? Sit in an office somewhere and fill out paperwork?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wedding guests, who had been trying to politely ignore our confrontation, were now staring openly, shocked by Kevin's casual dismissal of military service. I could see some older guests, probably veterans themselves, beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. I was about to respond when I heard a sound that made my heart race with anticipation, the distant rumble of jet engines approaching from the south. Right on schedule. "Kevin," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent reception area, "let me show you exactly what I do for a living." The sound of the engines grew louder, and I could see guests beginning to look around in confusion. Some were glancing toward the large windows that overlooked Lake Austin, trying to identify the source of the noise. The rumble intensified, becoming the unmistakable roar of military aircraft flying in formation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice trained to carry over the sound of jet engines, "if you'd like to step outside, you're about to witness a demonstration of United States Air Force precision and power." The guests began moving toward the terrace, drawn by curiosity and the increasingly loud sound of approaching aircraft. Patricia grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my uniform sleeve. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my uniform. "Patricia, I've arranged for a small demonstration to help your guests understand exactly what Captain Jessica Williams does for a living. I thought it would be educational." The first F-16 appeared over the tree line to the south, flying low enough that its shadow passed over the country club's manicured grounds. The roar was magnificent, a sound that never failed to make my pulse quicken with pride and recognition. The jet was followed by a second, then a third, then a fourth, all flying in perfect diamond formation, with the precision that only comes from hundreds of hours of practice and absolute trust in your wingmen. The wedding guests were now pressed against the terrace railing, their faces turned skyward in amazement and awe. The F-16s passed directly over the country club at approximately 500 feet, close enough that the guests could see the details of their weapons systems and the Air Force insignia on their wings. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out all conversation and commanding the complete attention of everyone present. As the formation completed its first pass and began banking for a second approach, I raised my voice to address the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is a flight of F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 149th Fighter Wing, demonstrating the capabilities that defend American airspace 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each of these aircraft costs approximately $30 million and represents the most advanced fighter technology in the world." The jets came around for their second pass, this time in line abreast formation, their afterburners briefly lighting as they accelerated over the lake. The sound was even more impressive this time, a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the country club. "The pilots flying these aircraft," I continued, my voice somehow carrying over the roar, "have undergone years of training costing millions of dollars per pilot. They represent the elite of American military aviation, and they're here today to honor one of their own." As if responding to a prearranged signal, the lead F-16 broke away from the formation and executed a perfect victory roll directly over the wedding venue. The crowd gasped in amazement, some applauding spontaneously at the display of precision flying. The pilot then rejoined his formation, and the four jets climbed away toward the north, their engine noise gradually fading but their impact on the assembled wedding guests permanent and unforgettable. In the silence that followed, I turned to face Kevin Thompson, whose face had gone from red to white to green during the course of the demonstration. "Kevin," I said quietly, "that's what I do for a living. I fly those aircraft in combat zones, where people are actively trying to kill me, and I do it to protect the freedom that allows you to attend fraternity parties and insult military service without fear of government retaliation." Kevin opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to form words. Around us, wedding guests were buzzing with excitement and amazement, their conversations focused entirely on the extraordinary aerial demonstration they had just witnessed. Mark appeared at that moment, having apparently been inside during the flyover. His face was a mixture of confusion and growing horror as he took in the scene, his military ex-wife in full dress uniform, his family looking shell-shocked, and his wedding guests talking animatedly about fighter jets instead of his marriage to Ashley. "Jessica," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What the hell was that?" I turned to him with a smile that felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in years. "Hello, Mark. That was the United States Air Force paying their respects to Captain Jessica Williams on your wedding day. I thought your guests might enjoy learning about the military service you used to find so embarrassing." Mark's face went through the same series of expressions his mother's had earlier, but magnified by the dawning realization that his carefully planned wedding had just been completely upstaged by the woman he had divorced for being too military. "This is insane," he stammered. "You can't just call in fighter jets to someone's wedding. This is supposed to be about Ashley and me, not about your ego and your need for attention." Before I could respond, Ashley herself appeared on the terrace, having clearly heard the jets from wherever she had been sequestered for pre-ceremony photos. Her face was radiant with excitement, and she was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. "Mark," she exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Did you see those fighter jets? Your mom said Jessica arranged for them. That's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. I had no idea your ex-wife was such a decorated military hero." Mark's expression grew even more pained. "Ashley, those jets were just showing off. It's not that big of a deal." Ashley stared at him in amazement. "Not a big deal? Mark, those were F-16 fighter jets flying in formation over our wedding. How is that not the coolest thing ever? And Jessica actually flies planes like that in combat. She's like a real-life superhero." I could see the exact moment when Mark realized that his new bride was more impressed by his ex-wife's military service than she had ever been by his legal career. The look of defeat on his face was almost pitiable, but I found I had no sympathy left for the man who had spent our entire marriage trying to convince me that my life's work was somehow beneath his family's standards. Patricia Thompson had been standing frozen throughout this entire exchange, but she finally found her voice as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Jessica, you've completely ruined Ashley's special day. This wedding was supposed to be about love and family, not about your desperate need to prove yourself." I looked at Patricia with genuine curiosity. "Prove myself?" "Patricia, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply showing your guests what United States Air Force capabilities look like when deployed in support of American interests. I thought you might appreciate a demonstration of the military power that keeps your country club lifestyle safe from foreign threats." "This is ridiculous," Robert Thompson interjected, his business executive authority finally asserting itself. "Jessica, I don't know what you paid those pilots or how you arranged this stunt, but it ends now. This is a private celebration, not a military recruitment event." Major Ryan Davis chose that moment to make his appearance, stepping onto the terrace in his own impeccable dress blue uniform. Ryan looked every inch the career military officer he was, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command authority and absolute respect. "Good afternoon," Ryan announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the kind of projection that came from years of addressing groups of pilots in loud environments. "I'm Major Ryan Davis, United States Air Force. I'm here representing the 149th Fighter Wing to present Captain Jessica Williams with a commendation for her outstanding service to our nation." The wedding guests, still buzzing from the flyover demonstration, turned their attention to this new development with obvious fascination. Ryan produced an official-looking document from his uniform pocket and began to read in his clear, authoritative voice. "Captain Jessica Williams is hereby recognized for exceptional meritorious service in combat operations over hostile territory, demonstrating the highest standards of courage, skill, and dedication to duty that reflect great credit upon herself, the United States Air Force, and the American people." He stepped forward and pinned a new ribbon to my uniform, the action performed with the kind of crisp precision that made it clear this was an official military ceremony happening in the middle of a country club wedding reception. "The flyover you just witnessed," Ryan continued, addressing the assembled guests, "was performed by pilots who specifically requested the honor of saluting Captain Williams for her leadership during combat operations that saved American lives and advanced strategic objectives in one of the most dangerous conflict zones in the world." The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt, coming from wedding guests who were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. These were people accustomed to country club ceremonies and corporate award banquets, but they recognized genuine heroism when it was presented with such obvious sincerity and official authority. Patricia Thompson looked like she might faint. Kevin had retreated to what appeared to be a safe distance near the bar, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Robert was frantically working his phone, probably trying to figure out if there were legal ramifications to having uninvited military aircraft fly over his son's wedding. But Mark looked devastated, and for the first time since arriving, I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for him. This was supposed to be his day, his moment to celebrate his new life with Ashley, his opportunity to demonstrate that he had moved beyond his first marriage and found true happiness. Instead, his wedding had been transformed into a celebration of everything he had tried to leave behind. Ashley, however, was absolutely glowing with excitement. She approached me with obvious admiration, her earlier curiosity now transformed into genuine respect and awe. "Captain Williams," she said formally, "I had no idea about your military service when Mark and I got engaged. He never really talked about your career, and I assumed you had some kind of administrative job. I'm so sorry if I seemed dismissive earlier." I smiled at Ashley with genuine warmth. "Ashley, you have nothing to apologize for. Mark probably didn't talk about my service because it made him uncomfortable. Some people have trouble understanding that defending freedom is a calling, not just a job." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "I completely understand now. And I want you to know that I have enormous respect for what you do. My grandfather was a Navy pilot in World War II, and he always said that military aviators were the bravest people he ever knew." The irony was perfect. Ashley Parker, the woman Mark had chosen specifically because she represented everything I wasn't, had just publicly declared her admiration for everything the Thompson family had tried to convince him to be ashamed of. Major Ryan Davis approached our group with the confident stride of someone who was enjoying the success of a well-executed mission. "Captain Williams," he said formally, "the wing commander asked me to extend his personal congratulations and to inform you that your request for extended leave has been approved. You're to report for your new assignment at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs next month." This was news to me, but Ryan delivered the information with such authority that everyone present accepted it as routine military business. In reality, I suspected this was Ryan's way of providing me with an elegant exit strategy from the increasingly awkward situation. "Thank you, Major," I replied with equal formality. "Please extend my gratitude to the wing commander and let him know I'm honored by his confidence." Ashley looked confused but impressed. "You're being promoted again? That's wonderful." "Mark, isn't it amazing that Jessica keeps advancing in her military career?" Mark's response was barely audible. "Yeah, amazing." Patricia Thompson finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual polished tone. "Major Davis, was it? I think there's been some misunderstanding here. This is a private family celebration, not a military ceremony. We didn't authorize any flyovers or award presentations." Ryan turned to Patricia with the kind of patient professionalism military officers used when dealing with difficult civilians. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Captain Williams is a decorated combat veteran who has earned the highest level of recognition from the United States Air Force. When she requested that her military family be allowed to honor her service at a significant personal event, we were happy to accommodate that request. The flyover was performed at no cost to your family and was part of a training exercise that would have taken place regardless." The explanation was smooth, official-sounding, and completely plausible to anyone who didn't understand military protocol well enough to question it. More importantly, it positioned my demonstration not as a disruption of their wedding, but as an honor that reflected positively on the entire celebration. "Furthermore," Ryan continued, "Captain Williams specifically requested that this recognition ceremony be kept brief and low-key so as not to detract from the primary purpose of today's celebration. We're simply honored to have been included in Mr. Thompson's special day." The crowd of wedding guests had been listening to this exchange with obvious fascination, and several approached me to express their admiration and ask questions about my service. For the next 20 minutes, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to know about flight training, combat missions, and what it was like to be a woman in military aviation. Their questions were intelligent and respectful, completely different from the dismissive attitude I had endured from the Thompson family for years. These people understood that they were in the presence of someone who had chosen service over comfort, duty over safety, and they wanted to learn about what that choice meant. Patricia and Robert huddled in what appeared to be an emergency consultation, probably trying to figure out how to regain control of their son's wedding. Kevin had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor and had retreated entirely from the terrace. Mark stood frozen near the edge of the group, watching his carefully planned celebration transform into something he had never intended. But Ashley was in her element, asking detailed questions about my training and expressing genuine amazement at the complexity of modern military aviation. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and soon other guests were joining the conversation, sharing stories about family members who had served and expressing gratitude for military service that seemed completely sincere. "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding coordinator announced, "we're ready to begin the ceremony. If the wedding party could please take their positions, we'll get started." The crowd began to disperse toward the ceremony seating, but Ashley lingered for a moment, looking at me with obvious admiration and what appeared to be a new understanding of something she hadn't known she was missing. "Captain Williams," she said quietly, "I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I'd be honored if you would sit with the family during the ceremony. You're clearly an important part of Mark's history, and I think you should be recognized as such." Patricia's gasp was audible from 10 feet away, but Ashley seemed oblivious to her future mother-in-law's horror. Mark looked like he might be physically ill. "That's very kind of you, Ashley," I replied, "but I think it's more appropriate for me to sit with the other guests. This is your day, and it should be about your future with Mark, not about his past with me." Ashley nodded, but her expression suggested she didn't entirely agree with my diplomatic response. "Well, at least promise me we can talk more at the reception. I want to hear everything about your military service." As the guests filed toward their seats for the ceremony, Major Ryan Davis approached me with obvious satisfaction. "Mission accomplished, Captain. I think your message has been delivered with appropriate impact." I looked around at the wedding guests, many of whom were still buzzing with excitement about the flyover and the impromptu award ceremony. The Thompson family looked shell-shocked, but Ashley looked happier than I had seen her all day. "Ryan," I said quietly, "I think you may have just changed the entire trajectory of this family's understanding of military service." He grinned with the kind of professional pride that came from executing a complex operation flawlessly. "That was the point, wasn't it? Sometimes civilians need to be reminded that their freedom doesn't maintain itself." The ceremony itself was beautiful, held in the country club's garden pavilion overlooking Lake Austin, with the Texas Hill Country rolling away into the distance. Ashley looked radiant in her designer gown, and Mark managed to pull himself together enough to say his vows with appropriate emotion. But I couldn't help noticing that several guests kept glancing skyward during the proceedings, clearly hoping for another aerial demonstration. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, there was a moment of perfect silence broken only by the distant sound of civilian aircraft passing overhead. I remained seated, of course, having no intention of disrupting their ceremony despite everything that had transpired earlier. But I did notice that Ashley kept glancing back at me during the vows, as if she was reconsidering some fundamental assumptions about what constituted a meaningful life and what kinds of achievements were truly worth celebrating. The reception that followed was unlike any wedding reception I had ever attended. Instead of the usual conversations about careers and real estate and vacation plans, I found myself at the center of discussions about military strategy, international relations, and the role of air power in modern conflicts. Guest after guest approached me with questions, stories, and expressions of gratitude that were both surprising and deeply moving. An elderly gentleman named Harold Morrison turned out to be a Korean War veteran who had served as a ground controller calling in airstrikes. "Captain," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "I want to thank you for your service, and I want you to know that what you did today was important. Too many people take military service for granted until they see it up close." A middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen told me her son was considering military service and asked if I would be willing to speak with him about aviation careers. "He's fascinated by flying, but his father and I worry about the dangers. Seeing you today, so accomplished and confident, It helps us understand that military service can be a path to real achievement and purpose. Even some of the younger guests, Mark and Ashley's contemporaries who I had assumed would be indifferent to military matters, seemed genuinely interested in learning about my experiences. A couple named David and Michelle Torres asked detailed questions about the training process and expressed amazement at the complexity of modern fighter aircraft. "I had no idea," Michelle said, shaking her head in wonder, "that fighter pilots had to master so many different skills. It's like being a scientist and an athlete and an engineer all at the same time." The conversations continued throughout the evening, creating an atmosphere that was part wedding reception and part informal military appreciation event. I found myself genuinely enjoying the interaction, realizing how rarely I had the opportunity to share my professional experiences with interested civilian audiences. Patricia Thompson made several attempts to redirect conversations back to traditional wedding topics, but her efforts were largely unsuccessful. The guests seemed far more interested in discussing military aviation than flower arrangements or honeymoon destinations. Mark spent most of the reception looking increasingly uncomfortable as more and more attention focused on his ex-wife rather than his new marriage. At one point, I saw him in intense conversation with his parents near the bar, their expressions suggesting they were trying to figure out how to regain control of their son's wedding narrative. But Ashley seemed to be having the time of her life, moving from group to group and encouraging more questions about my military service. She had clearly decided that having a decorated combat veteran at her wedding was something to be celebrated rather than hidden, much to her new in-laws' obvious dismay. The evening's culminating moment came during the traditional toasts. Mark's best man gave a speech about friendship and loyalty that felt oddly hollow given the day's events. Patricia offered remarks about family traditions and the importance of choosing the right partner, with several pointed glances in my direction. Then Ashley surprised everyone, including apparently Mark, by asking for the microphone to make her own toast. "I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate Mark and my new marriage," she began, her voice clear and confident. "But I also want to take a moment to recognize someone whose presence here today has taught me something important about courage and service." The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Captain Jessica Williams," Ashley continued, turning to look directly at me, "you have shown me what it means to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. Your military service, your willingness to risk your life for your country, and your grace in dealing with people who don't understand what you do. All of these things represent the kind of person I hope to become." The applause that followed was immediate and heartfelt, but I could see Mark's face going pale, and Patricia looking like she might actually faint. "Mark is lucky to have had you as his first wife," Ashley continued, apparently oblivious to the shock her words were causing, "and I'm honored to follow in the footsteps of someone who has achieved so much and served with such distinction." She raised her champagne glass toward me. "To Captain Williams, and to all the men and women who serve our country with honor." The toast was echoed by dozens of voices around the room, and I found myself genuinely moved by the unexpected recognition. This was what I had been seeking for years, not approval from people who could never understand my choices, but respect from people who could recognize the value of service when it was properly explained to them. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake my hand and express their appreciation for my service. Several asked for my contact information, wanting to continue conversations about military careers for their children, or to invite me to speak at various civic organizations. Mark and Ashley stood by the entrance, thanking guests for coming, but the conversations were dominated by references to the flyover and the award ceremony, rather than traditional wedding pleasantries. I could see Mark's forced smile becoming more strained with each mention of fighter jets and combat service. Major Ryan Davis found me as I was preparing to leave, his expression one of professional satisfaction mixed with personal amusement. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think we can consider this operation a complete success. The message has been delivered, received, and understood by the target audience." I nodded, looking around at the elegant country club venue that had been transformed into something I had never expected. A place where my military service was not just tolerated, but celebrated and honored. "Ryan," I said, I think we may have changed some minds today about the value of military service and the people who choose to serve. As I walked toward the valet stand to retrieve my rental car, Ashley Parker Thompson broke away from the receiving line and hurried after me, her wedding dress rustling against the polished floors. "Captain Williams?" she called, slightly out of breath from rushing in her elaborate gown. "I hope you don't think I was being inappropriate with my toast." I meant every word I said. I turned to face this young woman who had unknowingly become the instrument of my vindication, her face glowing with sincerity and excitement. "Ashley," I said gently, "your toast was one of the most meaningful recognitions I've ever received. You have nothing to apologize for." She smiled with obvious relief. "I want you to know that I plan to learn everything I can about military service and the sacrifices people like you make for our country. Mark may not understand it, but I do, and I think it's important." As I drove away from Riverside Country Club that evening, I realized that the day had accomplished something I had never anticipated. I hadn't just demonstrated my worth to people who had spent years trying to diminish it. I had discovered that there were people in the world who could recognize and appreciate military service when it was properly presented to them. The Thompson family would never understand what I did for a living, or why it mattered. But Ashley Parker Thompson, the woman they had chosen specifically because she represented everything I wasn't, had just publicly declared that she wanted to become more like the woman they had rejected. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being yourself, fully and completely, in front of people who have spent years trying to convince you that yourself isn't good enough. Today, Captain Jessica Williams had been fully herself, and the sky itself had saluted in recognition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.